after it was just after COVID.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Alaykum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh wa barakatuh.
Wa barakatuhu. MashaAllah. My dear beloved Sidi Ahmed, it's an honor to be here in your garden again, back here in this wonderful city of Cambridge. Many of us know about the book Rethinking Islam in the West, the presentation that you're going to be carefully elucidating and presenting in Bradford at the Literature Festival at the end of June. But before we dive into that particular book, I would like to get to know you. And there's a second book that you also produced, I believe during the pandemic period, called A Life's Journey, the story behind the book. So I would like the audience and our worldwide community to get to know a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to write this particular book, A Life's Journey.
Thank you. That picture was actually taken in the garden.
Yeah, in this garden, right?
In this garden, over there, and it was the time when the cherry blossom was out, and it was a very special time because it was just after it was just after COVID. Sorry, but just before COVID. And you see, the thing is that when I wrote this book, I kept it very short, very clear, and written in a manner that everyone can understand. Because I spent my life with scholars, and it's impossible to understand what they're talking about half the time.
Yeah.
And when they write books, they have to have endless, footnotes and the fact that so-and-so said so-and-so and so-and-so said so-and-so. By the time you got to the end of it, you're exhausted. And you haven't got necessarily through to what is or understood clearly what the thing's about. So this is a work which really takes from the world of knowledge and puts it into a form which everyone can understand. But when I finished this book, there was one scholar who said to me, he said, I was going to buy your book, he said, but I saw there were no footnotes, so I didn't bother with it. And then, of course, other people have asked me, how did this come about? How did you write this book? And then I realized that, the idea really came to me. When this book was launched, the professor of Arabic, who was the chair of the committee, a wonderful scholar, Professor Khalid Fahmi, he said, this book is not your usual academic work. It's the result of a life's journey. And this really made me feel that I had to show people that the background to this book was very sound. And not because of my knowledge, but because over a period of 50 years, and in fact over a whole lifetime, I have been through certain very clear experiences. I've lived in certain worlds. I've engaged with projects which I have learnt an enormous amount from, and I have met the most extraordinary people. And it is the accumulation of this experience and this knowledge, and knowledge which is engaged with experience. It's not separated in a book. It's a part of your actual experience. That I realized that I had a wonderful story to tell, which is not my life story. It's a story of my knowledge journey. So that's why it's a story behind a book. It's how this book came to be written. And it took me about a year to write this book. And it was a very painful experience because I had to go right back to the beginning, because one of the things which really informed my understanding was that I was born in a particular world, which was still intact. I moved from that intact world to a dissolution, and then I came into another intact world, which is of course the world of Islam. And when I looked back and started to ponder this and sort of try to understand it, it amazed me. Because you see, each one of those worlds, one of the things which I think is a part of my character, I fully engaged with. I was 100% committed to. And the first of those worlds was the world of the British Empire.
Right.
Because I was born in Windsor. And Windsor is like the centre of the British Empire. You know, the castle, His Majesty the King, the great King George VI, being born, seeing the soldiers marching up the high street with the changing of the guards, the wonderful bands playing. This was terrific. And I was born and grew up and spent my whole childhood in the environment of the British Empire. Why? Because I was a part of the class that was educated for empire. I was part of the class that was taken at the age of 8 and spent 10 years in special schools, boarding schools, away from home, trained so that they could then go and run an empire. And I can tell you that I just was at the end of that process. Nothing had changed. You know, for 100 years, the curriculum was exactly the same curriculum. We learnt to believe that the British were the supreme people on the planet, that were bringing civilization to darkest Africa, you know, who were going to India to save the Indians. We were India was the white man's burden. This is how we were taught. The Black Hole of Calcutta. Do you know about the Black Hole of Calcutta? Do you know the story of the Black Hole of Calcutta? When the whole group of British were massacred or died in this dungeon during one of the uprisings. That was the only thing I knew about India.
Right.
That and the fact that the wives were put on the funeral pyres. As far as slavery was concerned, we were taught about the fact that we, the British, had abolished slavery. William Wilberforce. Nothing about the fact that we were the biggest slavers the world has ever known. So by the time that education, which was a very, very powerful education, the discipline was unbelievable. It was an incredible discipline. And the idea was that by the age of 18, you could send somebody from that education anywhere in the world, and they would serve the nation. And they'd end up either in the army or the administration or the church or the law or whatever. Maybe judges or bishops or whatever. But this is the education. And I experienced that world.
And why did you find it important or significant to tell that part of your story and share those experiences and those personal accounts?
Because that formation, that being inside that world, made me understand how the whole Western civilizational narrative.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the whole business of the West going out and civilizing the world, or the British going out
Yeah.
and civilizing the world. I was able, through the fact of having been inside the process, the system,
Mm-hmm.
to understand the power of it.
Mm.
You know, to be born into that is something.
Yeah.
And to have that powerful belief in it, I'll explain to you a little bit later on why that is important in my life and my understanding. Because, you see, there was this incredible sense of primacy.
Mm.
You know, we British were the ultimate gift to humanity.
Mm.
When I left school, there was no empire.
Mm.
So I was fundamentally, I spent 10 years of education, I was out of a job.
Mm.
There was no world for us to go out and,
Mm.
And anyway, the whole thing was beginning to disintegrate.
Mm.
And then we hit the 60s. And during the 60s, there was the great cultural revolution in this country.
Mm-hmm.
This was the time when everything was up for question. Everything was ridiculed. The whole of the idea of the empire and everything was completely torn to pieces. In the theatre, in art, in the worlds that, were the avant-garde worlds.
Mm-hmm.
Beatlemania.
Yes, a completely new way of a complete rebellion. A huge surge up from the working classes.
Mm.
Boys at Eton started going around speaking as though they come from, East London.
Mm.
It was an incredible change that took place during that. And what happened was I found myself in the world of the arts, in the cutting edge of modernity, of the rebellion, during the 60s.
That's interesting. How did you find yourself being drawn into that world?
Well, it was very easy. And again, it was an amazing sort of set of coincidences.
Mm.
When I got to Lancing College, my public school, at the age of 14, I'd never been into the schoolroom had bored me to death. I'd never been able to engage with the school. But they were auditioning for the school play, which was Hamlet by William Shakespeare.
Oh, okay.
And I auditioned, and I got the part of Ophelia. I was 14 years old. This is a boys' school. I mean, you probably wouldn't understand this, but in Shakespeare's days, the boys used to play the girls' parts. Nothing to do with trance, at my public school, the boys played the young boys played the girls' parts. And I got the part of Ophelia, which is a big, major part.
Mm.
Ah, my goodness, this was it. This was the first time I really engaged with something and became totally absorbed.
Mm.
I loved that play. I used to go to all the rehearsals, whether I was a part of it or not. I learnt that by the time we were ready to put the play on, I knew the play by heart.
So your love and interest for drama and theatre started from a very
From there.
from
14.
14. From
And that was the end. Drama became my life. I set up, immediately I went back home to Windsor, I set up a dramatic society in Windsor. I was the youngest member. We were adults, part of it. And then I used to put on the plays. My father had, had a factory, and they had a wonderful carpenter shop, and I used to make, all the sets used to be made there, and I used to put on these fantastic plays in the holidays, and during the terms at Lancing, I would go to the school plays, and we did wonderful plays.
Mm.
And the height of my dramatic experience at Lancing was Dr. Faustus, where I played Dr. Faustus.
Mm.
And this is the great play by Marlowe. Again, wonderful language. And it was done in a garden like this. And it was a most magical experience. And people to this day remember it. I went back to an old boys reunion, a few years ago, and they all came up to me and said, Dr. Faustus, Dr. But this was my life. My life was the theatre, drama. And then my father, the idea of my going into the theatre was a terrible thought for him. This wasn't something which was liked by my class of people at that time. And so in the end they accepted the idea because there's nothing else for me. I couldn't have got into university. I had practically no qualifications. I got through the whole of my education without practically any.
Wow, okay.
But my goodness, I knew the theatre. And so I went and auditioned. And there were two major drama schools in London at the time. It was the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and the Central School of Speech and Drama. And this is a moment when if I had gone in one direction, we wouldn't be sitting here today. No question. I would either be dead or I'd still be in the theatre.
Right, okay.
The other one was what led me on my path.
Okay.
And the one that led me on my path was the Central School of Speech and Drama, because I went to audition to them first. And they had just formed an alliance with the Royal Court Theatre. Now the Royal Court Theatre was the place where the modern drama was being formed. They had just had a huge success with Look Back in Anger. It was the birth of the great revolutionary theatre, the theatre of angst, the theatre that was pulling down the church, pulling down the establishment, putting down the history, pulling everything to pieces. The kitchen sink drama, in which you had all the conflict between classes, the aridness of the modern way of life, the emptiness, the pinter, the non-communication. And I found myself accepted by this drama school. Now, this drama school, obviously I was a human being who would always sink himself into whatever situation he was in. And I was 18. So for 3 years, I was engaged with the great modern rebellious angst theatre, the drama. And what happened was very interesting, because it drained my love of theatre. I lived with Shakespeare and with Marlowe and with Christopher Fry and with Bernard Shaw, and the beautiful language and big drama. This one just drained me. I didn't know it at the time. But when you reflect back and you see these things, I lost my interest. And I was in that kind of no man's land where suddenly I was in a position where for how many years, from 14 to the age of 21, 7 years or so, I'd been completely absorbed in theatre. Suddenly it wasn't there anymore. And at that moment, again by a chance meeting, I found myself involved in modern art. Another of the revolutionary worlds, which in those days was battling for its survival. It wasn't accepted in this country. It was really having to still struggle to exist. And I found myself within a year with my father had this shop in Wigmore Street, 4-storey building, corner of Welbeck and Wigmore Street, and I convinced him to let me have it for an art gallery. And I had one of the biggest avant-garde art galleries in London, promoting kinetic art. And this is the art which tries to marry art and science, the art of movement. And of course I've threw myself into that. I had a wonderful time with the artists. Many of them lived in Paris, and I used to go over to Paris, and many of them were from South America. So I visited Venezuela and Brazil and went to the Sao Paulo Biennale. Got really, I was deeply involved. We had a newspaper, we had a fantastic thing going on. And then after 3 years, my father suddenly looked at the accounts, and I was draining the business, the family business. It was terrifying. So he put a stop to it. So after about 4 years of being in that world, suddenly it was stopped.
Did you enjoy working in
Oh,
that
it was fantastic. It was fantastic. The openings and the drama, bringing the artist over, putting on the exhibitions. It was wonderful. I enjoyed it enormously. But it was always, again, the artists are very interesting people. You know, artists are very, and these artists were, I mean, from my perspective now, as I see them, they were half crazy, but they were very interesting. And they were artists. But you'll see what happens next, you see, because it's very important. Anyway, that was closed. My father shut it. And you know, I tell the story in the book because that was one, again, enormously important. Because within months, the artists of my gallery, one of the works of art could have dealt with my debts. Now that my collection I had, which I had to sell, is worth millions. And I thank Almighty every day of my life that my father closed it. Because if it had gone on, I'm sure I wouldn't have survived my 30s.
So what did you do after that?
Then what happened was that all that I had left was a house in Islington, on the corner of Islington. A 3-story townhouse. And this was the 67, 68.
Right, okay.
All you need is love.
All you need is love. That period.
Coming over. And gradually my house started filling up. One time there were 70 people living in it. It was like, teepees. Each room would have teepees in it. Couples would live, or people would live, you know. And we had this outrageous group called the Exploding Galaxy, which is a multimedia group, dancing and poetry, arts, bringing all the arts together. Art and life, bringing life to art, the happenings, you know, on buses, in the parks in London, the whole thing's happening. The whole of life is a happening. Of course, helped along by a little bit of a puff.
Puff, yeah.
Yeah.
Of course.
And this was the 60s. And it was a complete rebellion against this empty modern way of life. It was a young rebelling. India started to become very important. A huge education we were going through because we were seeing India in a different light. We were seeing my childhood, the cowboys and Indians. It was the cowboys who were going like this to the Indians. Then we suddenly started to see the Indians. There was something different. I'm talking about the Red Indians, as we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Native Americans. You know, we started to study their worlds. So we went through a whole re-education where suddenly we started to see the world from another perspective, which is the perspective that we didn't have when we were a part of an empire, when we had that empire vision. So this is why I say it's very important. You know, I completely changed. So during the 60s, you were demolishing that previous understanding
Of the empires.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seems
Growing
like a paradigm shift.
Yeah, it's a complete paradigm shift. A complete paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And a complete rebellion against that. But there was not. But the way of life that we wanted to establish, of course, had no structure. We had our commune. And then the next thing that happened, you know, my father finished the gallery. What finished the commune were the police.
Right, okay.
Because they came and we used to have this place where we used to do rehearsals, and they came and they planted drugs. They wanted to break the group up. I mean, the neighbours couldn't put up with it. I mean, how can you live with 70 people living next door to you in a terraced house?
Yeah.
I mean, it's impossible.
Yeah.
So the neighbours were going crazy. But we were completely oblivious to
Oblivious
it.
to all of it.
Totally oblivious to it. So basically, the police came, they planted the drug there. I was taken off to prison for a night, and then came out. And then they planted drugs in the house, but I wasn't living in it. If I'd been living in it, they'd have taken me off and I'd have been it.
Mm.
But then I spent 2 years fighting the case. And that became a great drama.
Right, okay.
Became one of the big dramas of the time. And basically what happened was I was in touch with solicitors, I was in touch with journalists, I was in touch with the MPs. So I was organising again. I was back in the organising group, and we won the case. Basically, the police. There's only one of our group who was the oldest member of our group who was given a fine, and it was incredibly interesting because he was the one man who was an absolutely obsessive, pure man who never touched any substances or anything. You know, but they decided they had to, they had to sort of punish somebody, but. We all were free. We all and about 6 years later, the policemen who arrested us were themselves arrested because it was discovered that they had been taking drugs, selling them. You know, it was terrible corruption going on. But the wonderful thing about that was that the act of closing the thing up meant that I started relating to normal people. You know, it was interesting. But then, of course, the next great thing happened. Because all of this, in a sense, for me, looking back in terms of my book, was a preparation for the great moment of our lives. And a part of that great moment of our lives, of my life, had taken place because I had met my future wife. And we had come together.
So just weaving that into the story, when did you first meet your beloved wife Zainab?
I first met my wife Zainab just at just after the police had raided and taken us to prison, and so it was after that. It was when I was then fighting the case that I met my wife.
Nice.
And her family were very supportive. And she was about to go to university.
Just to pause you, were you living in London at the
We
time?
were in London, yes.
Okay.
No, we were in the heart of the...
In the heart of
it. And so basically what happened was that my wife was very much involved with music. And we were invited to a concert of North Indian classical music.
Okay.
And at that concert, it was a private concert, at that concert we met Ustad Mahmoud Mirza.
Right, okay.
And we then really experienced one of the most beautiful years of our lives.
The British Empire and Windsor. And thereafter you mentioned to us the story of how you immersed yourself and went into the world of theatre and drama. And then from the world of theatre you went on to the world of kinetic art and doing that particular world. And then when that came to an end, you were telling us about the cultural movement and then the 60s, and I think we had just got to the part where you had met your beloved wife. So from that particular point, to correct me if I'm wrong, is when you had met Zainab and you had met Ustad Mirza, right?
Yeah,
Together.
This is the moment when this is the great transformation of our lives.
Yeah.
Because when we went and when we met Ustad Mahmoud Mirza,
Yes.
basically we were of a generation that was lost. We were really lost.
So if I could step back for a second, what How did you even end up in the gathering to even know about Ustad Mirza?
Because it was to do with India.
Okay,
Anything to do with India we would know about that came to London.
so you were fascinated by the
Of course, we were delving into India. The whole idea we wanted to go to India, but of course the India that we were interested in was what we imagined to be India, which was Hindu India.
right.
We
okay.
knew nothing of
Muslim India.
of Muslim India.
Yeah.
We knew nothing of Islam. So when we met Ustad Mahmoud Mirza, we met something. We entered another world, but a world that was completely intact, because he is a master. In other words, as a master musician, he's completely in a state of stability. His identity is complete. There is no, there's no confusion about the man in terms of his being. He's a musician. He's a master. And of course, he's a Muslim, which is very important. This is a great.
Were you
great
immediately
position.
pulled in or impressed or?
It was an incredible thing. I mean, basically, what happened was that we spent a year basically with him here in London.
London, okay.
Yeah. Us showing him around London, him very quietly introducing us to his world,
Okay.
but very subtly, very, very beautifully. And the next big thing that happened was that, I will never forget this, we were on Marylebone Tube Station, on the underground, Marylebone Underground Tube Station. And our whole great plan was to go to India. And he said to me, he said, no, he said, go to America. It was amazing. So what happened was that I then went to America. I'm an organizer.
Yeah.
And I organized a tour of his music from Washington through to Boston,
Okay.
right? This is in 1968, 9, 69. And in America, I started getting really interested in trying to understand his culture. And I would go to the library at Harvard University and the wonderful collection of Kumaraswamy's miniature paintings at Boston University, and really sort of got, because of wonderful places there. And I was meeting curators and people in the museum world, because that's the world that, when I had my gallery, I was in touch with top people. And then I had this idea of doing a small festival to show the world out of which this music came, the courts of Mughal India. This is court music. This is the most refined music of the most refined courts possibly in history.
So because this is very important for me to understand. So you just mentioned that that's when the World of Islam Festival, the idea kind of came into your mind.
No, it wasn't the World of Islam
Okay.
Festival.
Okay.
This was to understand him.
Okay, so before the festival.
Yeah, this is to understand. So what I did, I went to Brandeis University, which was one of the places where we were going to have a concert. And I put to them the idea of a 3-day event in which we would have the poetry of the Mughal court.
Okay.
We'd have a Kathak dancer. We'd have Stuart Carey Welch, who was an expert on the miniature painting of the court, and we'd have the concerts of the music. So you'd see the music within its framework, and you'd start to understand how this music belonged, because this music is the equivalent in architecture of the Taj Mahal, or the architecture of India. It is the Muslim form of high classical music, right? So this is how I started. Now, then what happened was that after the tour, I came back to London.
Okay.
And I put the project on at the Institute of Contemporary Arts, the Arts of Mughal India. And then I had the big inspiration of my life. This is the moment. Because my kinetic artists, right, who are most of whom actually were Latin Americans or Spanish. You know, they were from the Iberian Peninsula culture, and they were fascinated by Moorish Spain because of the kinetic, the geometric patterns,
The patterns.
and they used to use the patterns in their
And the
designs,
symmetry, yeah, in the designs, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I knew something about the Alhambra. I knew something about Moorish Spain. And I was learning about Mughal India, and I suddenly realized that Mughal India, Moorish Spain, it's the same world.
Mm.
But the only
Interesting.
thing that connects them is Islam.
That's why you saw the similarities, okay.
Nothing else.
Nothing else.
That's when it clicked.
That's when it clicked. And I suddenly saw that I had this vision of the world of Islam. Through the art, the calligraphy, the geometric pattern, the architecture, the music, the form, the design, the unity, the beauty, it was just overwhelming, the beauty of it. And this completely took me over. The idea was incredible. So I went to the director of the Institute of Contemporary Arts, which is where I had, you know, connections from the past, from
Yeah.
when I had my gallery and
Yeah.
things. And I put it to him because I'd already done the Mughal arts. I said, I would like to do a festival of the world of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
This was back in 1970.
What was the response?
So he was perfectly happy. And so in 1971, in November, December 1970, we had a small festival. It was the first time, by the way, that the Mevlevi whirlers came over.
Right. First time to
We had the whole group, but we had the old musicians. It was fantastic. And we had this event, lasted for 21 days. We had a very beautiful exhibition of geometric pattern. We had, you know, the whole thing went extremely well. But again, we come to one of the great moments of my life, because there was a problem, and that was that 6 months before the festival took place, the director of the centre came to me, David Thompson, and he said, "Paul, I'm sorry, but we have a problem with our grant. We're not going to be able to fund your festival. So you're going to actually either have to raise the money, or, you know,
we can't proceed or go ahead.
yeah, we can't go ahead." So of course I wasn't going to not do it. So I had to raise the money.
And how long is this before?
6 months before it.
And how much did you need to raise?
Well, put it this way: when all the bills were paid and everything was done, I owed £10,000,
Wow.
which in those days was a lot.
Was
of
a
money.
lot of money.
I'd raised about 7,000,
Wow.
but £10,000.
And this is 1976?
It's 71.
71. Wow, okay.
But this is what led to the big festival.
Leading up
I'm
to
telling you the story of how that festival came about, because I wouldn't have done it otherwise. It came about because I was in a problem. I didn't want to go bankrupt again. I was finished by my gallery when that went bust. You know, I wasn't wanting to go through that again.
to go to the
So
financial hit.
in January of 1972, my brother got married in Switzerland to a lovely Swiss lady in Zurich. So a week before he got married, I went to Switzerland. I went up into the mountains and stayed in a chalet, in a little hotel. And I had to go through this process of thinking, what can I do? Because I was facing ruin. And I asked myself the question, is the World of Islam Festival a good idea? And the answer that came back was the following: yes, but you've got to do it at the top level. You've got to engage all the major institutions. You've got to use all the media, from exhibition to film to publishing, to seminars, to lectures, and you've got to have the Queen opening it. And my
Why-
answer to this is that it?
But why were you so convinced, like really pulled in by, like, why were you so committed to go ahead and do this at that time?
I was desperate
Yeah, why?
because I was going to be ruined, and because the final thing the answer that came to me was, if you go and organise the project on that scale, which is what it should be.
Yeah.
This is a huge subject, and it should be on that scale. Then what you've just done can be seen as a startup. You know, the part of the research, and you can pay the pay the debt.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's how the festival came about. I came back to London like really driven. Remember, I wasn't a Muslim at this time. I was really driven. I was living inside this idea. This is my home. And I went to the Arts Council and I put the idea of I wanted the major arts exhibition to be with the Arts Council, because they were the ones who did the big shows. And it so happened that the chairman of the exhibitions committee happened to be a man who didn't like Islamic art. So the director, who loved the idea, said, look, he said, you can't, if we put it to the committee now, it could be turned down and that would be the end of it. But he said the chairman's retiring in a year, and we've got a new chairman then, and then we can get it through. So I had a year to hold up my situation. Nothing coming in with these huge debts. So I then went to all the different institutions. I went to the British Museum, the V&A, the Science Museum, the British Library, the Museum of Mankind, the Horniman Museum, the Commonwealth, and I told them, looking at the kind of project they could do to complement the Arts of Islam exhibition, the Quran exhibition for the library, the Science exhibition for the Science Museum. And I said to each of them, if the Arts Council decide to go ahead with this project, will you join in and do such and such a thing? And I got their sort of agreement in principle. And then after a year, and of course going to my creditors and saying to them what was going on, it's a terrific thing. It's a thing any organizer who's ever done anything knows, what you have to do. So at the end of the year, the Arts Council agreed, put up £200,000 for the project. It was there.
Wow.
That was the basis. And then, of course, the universities came in, the learned societies came in, the publishers came in, everybody came in. And I formed this trust. And then the month the trust was formed, which was October 1973, do you know what happened? That month, oil price skyrocketed.
Yeah.
And suddenly there was the money there to turn it into the greatest event that has ever taken place in London of its kind. That was the story. But this took me from 1970 through to 1976.
6
But
years
my
of
engagement,
struggle,
my engagement was from 69, from the meeting with Mahmoud Mirza, which happened at the end of 68. The exploration of that world began at the end of 1968 through to 1976. So can you imagine? I had access to, I was engaged with, I was bringing in, we had thousands of works of art coming into England from 32 different countries, from over 200 collections. I was dealing with the top curators. I was handling the most valuable things. I was dealing with the scholars from all the different aspects. It was the biggest education that you could possibly have, because it was an education which was done through love. I was in love.
Was it during this period that you then
6 months.
embraced?
6 months before the festival, I was an eclectic. I didn't want to become like Lawrence of Arabia, schizophrenic. My whole life, I was surrounded. All my friends were Muslims by that time. You know, and it wasn't the religion; it was the culture. It was the food, the music. It was the friendship. That's what brought me into Islam. So 6 months before the festival, I became a Muslim. But I entered into it, you know, because it was the most natural thing for
It was
me.
a natural process.
To happen. It had to happen. And that's one of the things I've seen over my life, is that, you know, because now nearly 50 years since that time, is the way in which Islam, people come in from every different angle.
Absolutely. So you spent probably in the excess of 8 to 9 years, at least dedicating your time towards this World of Islam
Oh,
festival.
absolutely. I mean, no, I mean, this was my life.
And you were not Muslim until
No, no.
6 months before the.
yeah.
And and obviously it happened as God ordained it in a natural process 6 months before. But you were so inspired by the art and the culture and all these other beautiful aspects of Islam.
Yeah.
Or
I was
Islamic culture.
inspired by this vision.
This
This
vision.
vision of this beauty. You know, you see, the thing that is very important, which I've realized,
Yeah.
which I don't think I put in the book really, but clearly enough, but what I realized was that I came from a background in terms of my sort of empire education of huge certainty. The certainty of being a part of something that was the best. You know?
And it also had a vision.
Yeah, and it
where
did.
it was
Yeah.
going.
Now, when that broke down, when that crumbled, the only thing that could possibly take me was something in which it had that vision of the best, but that best would not crumble.
Interesting.
Because I had to give my whole being to the thing. I had to be totally involved in it. So it was that sort of totality of conviction that was so important. And of course, this is what I found with Islam, is that the deeper you go into understanding it, and I'm just on the very, you know, outer edge of it, the more that certainty
Comes
of
further.
it being the best, the perfect. So this was the great moment of my life. And of course, what happened was that after the festival, which was a great success, and it was a moment before all the craziness, before political Islam, a time when people knew nothing about Islam and people didn't even care much about it. You know, it wasn't in the
It wasn't on the
news.
radar.
You know,
How was the World of Islam Festival received, and did it meet your expectation or exceed your expectation when you finally were able to implement and execute your ideas?
I didn't have any expectations.
Okay.
I had no expectations. I wasn't thinking in those terms. By the time we got on to as you'll read in my book, it was a very tough journey, getting it complete, but we got it there. We got it there, and my only concern was to get it there. After that, it was amazing, because then my life went from really one project to a second project to a third project, 3 big projects, none of which were realized. And it wasn't until I started working on the book thing, that I realized why they hadn't been realized, and why they couldn't have been realized, and why it was important that they weren't realized. How everything happened as it should have done.
As it should have done, as Allah wanted.
But at the time, it's very painful.
It's very painful.
It's very painful.
So how did you come to that, over time, that reflection or that contemplation that it happened in the right way, and it's good that it didn't happen? What made you come to
Well,
that realization?
I suppose that what really was a catalyst for all of this was when I arrived at the age of 70, the third of my big projects, which was the Golden Web, which I'd worked on for 20 years, came to an end. It was closed. It finished. The project was terminated. The foundation I had set up was closed. And I was in a state of being 70 years old, having several grandchildren by that time, having a very happy family life, and being in a position where I accepted the fact that in worldly terms I hadn't been successful. I accepted it. There was huge success when I was young, then nothing, just one thing after another. Huge, great exhibition project with the Saudis. Never realized, you know? And then other things would happen. And then what happened was that there was a friend of mine, actually out in the Gulf, who whenever I went there, he was a very senior man, and he used to love having me for lunch and for us just to talk. And he loved to listen to my ideas, my reminiscences. This was in the, before my foundation closed. And he said to me one day, he said, you must write a book. I said, I'm not going to write a book. And he said, no, you should write a book. He said, you've got some wonderful ideas, and also you've been very fortunate. You've met a lot of interesting people in your life. You've had a very interesting life. You should write a book. Mm-hmm. And then he said to me one thing which sort of stuck with me a little bit, which was, you have a duty to write a book, because the generation coming up will never have experienced what you've experienced. Anyway, I didn't take any notice of it, because that's the last thing I would be interested in at the time, was writing a book. I'm an organizer. Mm. You know? So when I was 70 and the gallery was closed and I was out of a job, my foundation was closed, about a few months in, after my 70th birthday, I received this postcard that said, how's the book going?
From a neighbour.
From the guy, from the friend. And at that moment, I started to think, because what else, I mean, I hadn't got anything. I was 70 years old. I was without a project. I'd lived my life inside projects, and being that was my territory, that was my world, inside projects. Suddenly I was outside of them. So then, of course, I decided, in the end, I accepted the idea that I had to write a book. Mm. And then we came to the point where, so this is where the reflection began. That's where I started piecing everything together. Mm. And understanding, because you see, there are two big insights. One was the insight of the world of Islam. The other insight was the complete difference between the modern and the traditional. The traditional art is of a completely different species to that of the modern. The modern artist is a poor creature who's terribly deformed, mm-hmm. who's dependent upon their own imagination and their own egos and the rest of it. The traditional master has risen to the point where he is in communion. His inspiration, he's open to inspiration. That's a different world. That's a completely different world. And that's where the traditional and the modern. And that's something which I understood very early on meeting Ustad Mahmoud, because I had been immersed in the modern. I knew it inside. I knew its philosophy, I knew its structure, I knew how the people behaved in it. I knew its temperament, I knew everything about that modern. Mm-hmm. I'd been inside it. And then I went and I was inside. And when looking back on this thing, it was like an aberration I was looking at, compared to the tradition. So that became the clearest thing. And then with the Islamic, the world of Islam, seeing the unity and in terms of the beauty of Islam, through the beauty, that complete coherence, that mizan, that balance, that perfection which you find within the whole structure of art. I realized that structure, that perfection, had to run through every aspect of Dar al-Islam. Through the Sharia, through the relationship of how the political structure worked with it. How could a world which covered all the different civilizations, all the different geographies, all the different races, all the different languages, from West Africa to China, exist in one world if it wasn't a perfect structure?
I mean, in perfect harmony with each other.
A perfect structure. The structure of Islam is amazing, but we don't look at the structure. We look at the from a historical Western perspective. The Umayyads and the Abbasids and the Seljukids and the Ottomans, and we think of it as, this is not how it worked with Islam. These political structures were part of, they played their role. They came and went. When the Roman Empire fell, the whole civilization collapsed. But in Islam there are hundreds of dynasties which came and went. The world of Islam continued because the structure is a miracle. And it is a divine structure. It's a structure that came from the revelation. This is my work now. Because people cannot see that. They see Dar al-Islam from a Western perspective, a Western historical perspective of progress. Muslims, when I came into Islam, one of the things which really I was surprised by was the depression of the Muslims. The way the Muslims would talk about, if we had been good Muslims, the West would never have come and overwhelmed us. Or the people are saying, once the Arabs left Arabia, everything went downhill. With the Umayyads, the whole thing goes to the pot. Or the golden age of Islam, we had this wonderful golden age, and then the Arabs say, when the Turks came, they ruined everything. This is the sort of thing this is the thing you hear. And it's all nonsense. It's all nonsense. The miracle of Dar al-Islam is the most perfect, the most incredible structure that was ever created. And it came out of 23 years of revelation. 23 years when the Holy Prophet ﷺ and a whole community, a complete community, lived revelation. Can you imagine living revelation? And that meant that was why the power of that way of life that was established with the Prophet ﷺ was so powerful. That is why Islam was so successful so quickly and covered the whole of the earth. That's why. It was because it was complete in its heart. It was that revelation. There's nothing like it in history. And there's nothing like Dar al-Islam in history. But we're looking at it through glasses which completely distort that viewpoint. And that's what the MIZAN thesis is attempting to clear. So this is what when I started my reflections, these thoughts started to come, and because I had, in a sense, through accepting and looking at Islam through the eyes of MIZAN, it's why then you start to see what the crisis. The modern world is terrifying now. The scientists who have created the crisis we're in, they're the ones who are telling us about it. They're the ones, it's the people who invented AI, all the leaders of AI, who are now telling us that it's going to exterminate us.
It's going to exterminate us and it's being harmful to humanity. Yeah.
So this is what. So this is where the MIZAN thesis gives you a clear understanding of the West, of the modernity, And it opens up the vision of Islam, because we have to recover that vision.
I was going to ask you, Ahmed, what do you think is the first step that the Ummah or the world of Islam needs to take in order to regain that balance and that structure that you mentioned was the kind of super glue that held the...
Yeah.
the
It's a very important question, this, and it gets to the very root of our problem. Because you see, Dar al-Islam, the great creation of this world which existed for more than 1,000 years, in a state of stability. That world was destroyed. But what remains, it's like we're back in Mecca of the Holy Prophet. The only difference is that it's everywhere, because Muslims are everywhere. The religion is completely intact, but it's surrounded by a gathering chaos. You can't recreate what was there before. You have to understand what is our role now. And our role now is to provide the refuge and to provide witnessing al-haq, the truth, because everywhere else is becoming untrue, unreal. The world that we're living in is a world which is becoming, by the month, more and more unreal, and people are lost and confused, and the chaos is just growing. But for Muslims, that center, everything that was a part of the origin, plus all the wisdom that has accrued to Islam since then, through the great masters of tradition, is there to support and witness al-haq for our time. That's the role of the Muslim. It is to give, because that's where, that is the reality. The reality is that the world is in a state of complete confusion. You only have to see what the scientists are saying. The scientists are telling us global warming, pandemics, just think of all these things. You can't reverse this. And this is Almighty Allah's show. He is the producer, he is running it. Our job as Muslims is simply to witness, to maintain.
It's very interesting you mentioned that. So you just going back a little bit, you were talking about how you had the kind of unique experience through your life journey of being able to be part of that world to some extent and seeing the modern world and seeing how society and culture was.
Absolutely.
And then looking back in retrospect, in hindsight, you're able to see the deep aberration that world had, like I said, between modernity and traditionalism. So that gives you a unique footing to be able to see the two worlds and also being able to live parallel in many ways to that modern world and be part of that, but be able to see that is something which, like you said, is an aberration. How do people in this day and age as Muslims, leading off what Genc said, how do we become a community that becomes a little bit more aware of the crisis and the issues that are surrounding us today, and to not be caught up in the whole web of the modernity? Because like I said, many people unfortunately do not know or don't see the difference of it not being progress, of modernity not leading us into enlightenment.
They can't see
So how do we educate? I'm sure that this telling about your life journey and obviously the Rethinking Islam in the West and the presentation we're going to do is a step in that direction.
Absolutely.
But how do we get Muslims to really start thinking and seeing reality for what it is?
Well, I think, everybody's doing what they can, but as far as when I got the opportunity of working with a group of students at Cambridge, wonderful group of students, what we did was to try to take this book, which is basically, this is the case it's making, and to extract from it the key message. So to say that, if you've got an audience for a couple of hours, which is all you're going to get them for, can you get the message across? So that's what we're doing. But there are. Look, you know this. The thing about Islam is that the religion is completely intact. You've got the sheikhs, you've got the teachers, you've got wonderful people everywhere. You've got people who are living, most important, living the deen, living the life. You've got the examples. In this country, your grandparents, the people who came here, they were amazing. They kept it alive under the most appalling conditions. They are great heroes. How they could continue, and they were simple people. They came from simple backgrounds. They weren't scholars or anything. They were simple Muslims. So this is the point.
But they kept the traditional life. Yes.
Everything is there, and the thing we have to be very important about. We mustn't worry about how the thing will unfold.
That's true.
It's unfolding. It's his play.
It's his affair.
And you see, this is where theatre was a great training for me, in the sense that we are the actors.
Yeah.
We don't produce the play.
Because he's the director.
He's the play.
He's the director.
He has a play. We only have our. That's why for us it's to be aware of that. So for us to start worrying about global warming or anything like this, it's nonsense.
So what's actually that's interesting. So how, in this world of theatre, what is the role of us as actors?
Well, each of us have to know what that is. I mean, that's one of the big things of life, isn't it?
Yeah.
To discover what is your
Role.
what is your
purpose,
role,
yeah.
and it's very difficult for people, other people to tell them. People, and that's one of the great things in life is to find that. Nowadays, it's very difficult, but we all have certain fundamental roles, like we have roles with our husband or wife, we have roles with our children, we have roles with we have roles with our neighbours, we have roles with our friends, we have roles, with our communities. These are fundamental, and we know how we're supposed to behave in these things. That's all there. The difficulty thing is that the actual world that we're living in terms of its structure, is an alien structure. It's a structure that is destroying the world. It's a destruction which as the great historian Dawson, the Catholic historian Christopher Dawson said many years ago, he said the problem with modernity is it's cut off its connections to heaven, and it's cut off its connections to the earth. It's created this kind of
In
limbo world which only makes sense in its own terms, but is in the process of destroying its relationship with the earth. And it's cut off its relationship with heaven. And when you talk about AI, when does God come into AI?
Exactly.
So it's completely cut off. Now for us Muslims, we are living in this very dangerous world, in which one has to tread very carefully. And it's getting more dangerous because it's getting more and more incoherent. But its power is growing. The power of technology, is growing, but the actual structures that keep it together, the human structures, are fragmenting. The belief in it is disappearing. You go to the ordinary person now out in the street and they're depressed.
Yeah.
And
This is why
confused.
for the Muslim, we are not. How can we ever be depressed? Because we have to be a refuge for their incoherence. We have to be a refuge, and we have to be a witness to al-haq, the truth. And that is take care. And if you think of the mosques, you think of the people, like the Cambridge Mosque, all the people who come to it, the converts, the worship 5 times, it continues that glorious centre of human existence, which is the worship of God. All of these are there. And the wonderful teachers and the great sheikhs, everything is there. All that we're trying to do with this is to change people's perspectives, to be able to see how magnificent that is and how it is very different. These worlds are not, you can't marry them. You can't marry them. The minute you start trying to make a marriage with modernity, it starts to deconstruct you.
You've made a really beautiful point there that I wanted to kind of further enhance upon. So now we're coming towards rethinking Islam in the West. We saw all these different ideas in your journey of Islam and your own personal experiences, which are very, very unique, mashallah. And I think there's a huge benefit to tell them to the communities. How do you What is your contention, I would say, through this MIZAN thesis and this presentation? What do you hope and what would you like to achieve by disseminating and propagating this MIZAN thesis out there?
Well, just to encourage understanding.
Mm.
I mean, what we're doing is simply trying to make clear the MIZAN thesis, which is, put in a nutshell, that the reality of the world, a principle of the reality of existence is the balance, is the MIZAN. That is the ordering, justice, this rich term MIZAN, the scale, the measure. This is fundamental. Progress, which is the narrative that governs the modern world, that props it up, that is the belief system, which if you remove it, there is nothing in secular world. If modernity is not improving existence, what is the point of it?
Exactly.
But that concept of progress is false.
It's not only
True
improving,
and
it's potentially
fruitful.
harming, potentially.
It is absolutely devastating. It is
Devastating.
destroying the human soul. It's destroying the human family. And what we do in the book is to show how this came about. It's a very long process. It starts as a seed in the 16th, 17th century. It comes out of, which we show.
Yeah.
And we show the very, very wonderful distinction about the reasoning mind. How in the West, the reasoning mind has descended into the material realm.
Yeah.
In Islam, it ascended
It's ascended.
to the highest point of the knowledge of God. This is wonderful work that was done by Shaykh Hassan Spiker
Yes.
to bring out the traditional knowledge, which is all there. Which is all there, but nobody's been interested in it because everybody's interested in the golden age of Islam, in which Islam contributed towards modernity, which is a false story. It did no such thing. It did no such thing. Modernity was produced out of a change of perspective which took place in the Western mind. It has nothing to do with Islam.